helps the citizens of emerging markets? Because if it doesn't, then what's the use? Now let's talk about Africa here. In Africa currently, this map shows you that a lot of people, especially sort of in the middle, have very little access to electricity. And so the dark red means that more than 75% of citizens does not have access to electricity. Now we also know that access to electricity is key in economic development, and that investing in electricity is also something that has huge economic benefit, is what financial economists would say is hugely NPV positive, so the net present value is very positive of investments in electricity. Now that is very simple to do in a city where people live closely together, so you can build electricity network in the ground or what mostly goes through the air, so you see these spaghetti bundles of electricity cables through the air. And then if a city gets richer, then it goes into the ground. But that's what you see in cities. But although urbanization is going on in emerging markets and also in Africa, a lot of people still live outside of cities. And then it's far more expensive to build an electricity grid. Now, 10, 20 years ago, that would have been almost unsolvable because the distances are too great and the infrastructure is too poor to do that. But currently, you can leapfrog towards an off-the-grid electricity system using solar mostly, maybe some wind, but mostly solar, renewable energy, renewable electricity. And again, making these investments is an investment that is very, very NPV positive. So you can actually make this investment and make a good return, and make a good financial return on it. So institutional investors could do it, but people in emerging markets could do it too. But the point is they don't have access to the capital. So it's not so much a problem that there should be going subsidies into this. No, this is really something that the market in principle could solve. So financially this is a very attractive investment, but there's no financing or no access to financing to accomplish this. And since it's off the grid, you should help individual villages or individual families do that, and they don't have access as citizens to finance. So how can finance help to accomplish this? This is the key issue. This is really a financing problem. How do we finance these investments? Okay, now, and then the question is, do global financial markets help this? So let's talk about what is finance for in general. And then we're going to talk about whether finance achieves these goals in emerging markets, and then we're going to talk about financial exclusion and inclusion, basically the solutions to financial exclusion. So finance, you could say, has 5 basic functions. The first is a reliable and efficient payment and money transfer system. So for us, it's totally taken for granted that, so for example, we have COVID, and shops didn't want to accept cash money anymore, so then we said, okay, we go to credit card, we go to plastic debit cards, fine, and we switch. You don't even have to think about it. But if you're living in a slum in an emerging market, then this is a huge problem, because making payments that way, well, if you don't have a bank account, you can't do that. And that's then making payment in your own store. But let's say that, like your parents can easily transfer money to you if you have to pay the rent here in Maastricht. But let's say you live in an emerging economy and your kid goes to the city to study. How do you transfer money to that child? The city is 1,000 kilometers away. You don't have a bank account. Your kid may have or may not. Kid has to pay the rent in the city. You want to pay for the kid. How do you do it? And you think, if you think about it, how complicated that is. It is hugely complicated if you don't have that simple access to efficient money transfer systems that we have. So that makes life really very difficult if you don't have that. So that's a key function of finance. The second function is a safe place to store money temporarily. So you have money in your pocket, and then I can put it on my bank account. I don't have to think about it. Even if the bank gets robbed, I still have my money. And even if there's a fraud in the bank, I still have my money because the government has deposit insurance, etc. So, for me, it's very simple. I just go to the bank. I don't have to think about it. If you don't have a bank account, and if you live in a slum, and your door really has no lock, what do you do with your money? Well, maybe you keep it on you, but then maybe you get robbed. Or, well, again, very, very complicated. If you have it, you don't have to think about it. If you don't have it, it's a huge problem. Number 3 is providing reliable ways to save and invest. So, for example, maybe people want to invest in electricity grid, or maybe in the electricity grid from somebody else, or maybe put their money into the bank. But if there's no bank account and if you can't get access to these investments, again, problem. Number 4 is to provide credit to households and credit and equity capital to business. So, for example, I'm a household and I want to buy a house and I want to put renewable energy on top of the house, solar panels, and I want to have a loan for that. But the bank doesn't give me a loan because it doesn't know me or it doesn't trust me or I'm too small of a client or whatever, then that investment that would be very worthwhile for me, for my family and for society will not be made. And so that's a loss of productivity and a big problem for me. And the last one is diversification and financial risk management. Basically the opportunity to spread your risk, because if you're living in an emerging market, if you're a citizen of an emerging market, your life risks are very much bigger, and you have also a lot of risk that is hard to insure, hard to diversify. So finance could play a role there, but it really doesn't so much. Now, if you look at access to finance, financial inclusion, saying, well, to what extent do citizens have a bank account? Because a bank account, that's the thing that it starts with. If you have a bank account, you could say you're financially included, and you could use that as a base to also borrow or something else. And you see that dark blue means between 90 and 100% of grown-ups have an account. So that's not so surprising. That's Western Europe, Australia, Northern America, etc. And the more yellowish you get, greenish, yellowish you get in this graph, in this map, the less people have bank accounts. So, for example, if it's really yellow, lots of Africa, South Asia, there less than 20% of people have a bank account. And even in South America, you're talking about numbers of between 20 and 65%. So there are a lot of people without a bank account, a lot of people without access to finance, without access to the functions that I just talked about here. And that makes their life very, very complicated. Now, and do financial markets perform satisfactorily? No, if you look at the map that I just showed you, they don't. But the good news is that there is a solution in sight. And it's not a solution that is made by the World Bank or made by the governments of institutional investors of emerging markets. No, this is a financial innovation through mobile phones. It's called mobile money. And this mobile money is, the way it works is that you have a phone and then you can put money on that phone. You can transfer that money to somebody else's phone, and that somebody else can go to a money agent, a wakala. This is a picture that I took in Tanzania 2 years ago. And that wakala can then give you cash money if he looks at your phone and that there's indeed money now on your phone. So one very important one is M-Pesa. It comes from Vodafone, but there are all the phone providers provide also mobile money. And through this mobile money, all of a sudden, people who did not have access to finance at all now have access to money and payment and money transfer systems. They can deposit their money through their phone on an account with M-Pesa or with Tigo or Airtel or one of the others. They can save. There's also savings accounts that have been opened, and even they can start to get credit and equity capital to finance a loan or to finance a business or a house, etc. And it's all just beginning. We're not there yet, but it's very much happening, and we have I have a couple of slides about it. There's also a paper in the literature for this week talking about it. So only diversification and financial risk management, that's not possible with these two, but mobile money is really very promising when it comes to providing additional financial access to people in emerging markets. Now, what is the root cause to financial exclusion? So we can talk about it in a descriptive way, but we first have to really understand it. And there is a very important paper by two American authors, Stiglitz and Weiss. Stiglitz is actually a Nobel Prize winner in economics. The paper came out in the American Economic Review in 1981, so already 40 years ago. And the American Economic Review is the most important scientific journal in economics, so that shows you how important this paper is. And what they showed in that paper theoretically is that credit and insurance markets differ fundamentally from other markets. So, in what way? Well, first, in the ways that the pricing mechanism doesn't really work for these markets. And why is that the case? Well, first there is something. Let's imagine a situation first where I take a loan from you. So you lend money to me, but you don't really know me. So this is actually the first. We have it actually maybe, I don't know if you met in the flesh, maybe just on video. You don't know me. Maybe I'm not going to pay back the loan. So there is something called adverse selection. And maybe actually I'm a bad person who is unlikely to pay back that loan to you. And but that's one thing. But if I already know up front that I'm gonna not pay back that loan, I'm even more likely to come to you to make that loan, to get that loan, because then I'm not going to pay it back anyway, so I want that loan because fine. And then you say, well, okay, you know, what I'm going to do, I'm going to charge an extra high risk premium so that I am rewarded for that additional risk that Pete maybe is not going to pay back that loan. And if you do that, then the people who are honest say, okay, but this is too expensive. I'm actually not gonna borrow money with that person. It's too expensive for me. And the only parties who remain are the bad guys like me, and they still want your money because they're not going to pay the interest in the loan back anyway. So that's a problem. Eh? You have different types of borrowers, good ones and bad ones, and increasing your pricing, increasing your interest rate to reflect for that risk doesn't really work to weed out the bad ones. It actually weeds out the good ones. And that means that this market really can't work. Then there's moral hazard. Let's say that I told you that I would take out that loan to start a business, and that with that business I would generate money, profit, and with that profit I can pay back the loan. But instead, I'm not going to do that. With that money, I'm going to give a big party. And after 2 weeks of partying, the money's gone, and I don't have an income to pay you back. That's moral hazard. So maybe I'm going to use that credit for something else, and that something else will then not allow me to pay back the loan to you. I mean, I'm more risky. And then there's a thing called imperfect information, asymmetric information. You don't know whether I'm a bad guy or not. And so you can't distinguish up front between good borrowers and bad borrowers, and you have to treat them all the same. And these things mean that there could be no credit even for those who are willing to pay a high price. And that means that the markets for credit and insurance could completely fall away. And so these markets are not markets that can happen, that always can happen. A lot of prerequisites need to be there for this to work in a good way. And especially very important is that this imperfect information, that asymmetric information, is reduced. Now, what have been historic solutions for that? And why do I look at history here? Well, because in our history, in Europe and in the United States, we used to be emerging markets. So what we have done 50 to 100 years ago could be relevant to what emerging markets can do now. So, for example, in Europe, farmers set up cooperative banks Because there was no banks, no banks for normal people before the 19th century. There was just the elite that had banks. And there was some informal one-to-one credit. There were some loan sharks charging you 100%, and then for everybody else. And then a German guy, Friedrich Raiffeisen, he set up a cooperative lending bank to help farmers. And these farmers knew each other very well. And since they knew each other very well, they didn't have this information problem, this asymmetric information problem, because they knew Heinz is a good farmer and Karl is a bad farmer. So Heinz gets the money and Karl doesn't. And so that's how simple that was. They knew each other and thereby reduced these Stiglitz and White's problem. And then they created a regional bank to bring these together, and that example was followed all over Europe. So for example, in the Netherlands, you still have the bank called the Rabobank, and the Rabo is a Raiffeisen Boerenleenbank, so that's also an agricultural bank. Still one of the biggest banks in the Netherlands, based on the thinking of Raiffeisen. Then, but this was in the country. In the cities, this didn't work. There were no farmers in the city. So in the cities, government stepped in to set up post banks around 1900. To begin, these post banks were used so that people could put their salaries and their wages into the bank instead of taking it in their pocket and drinking it away. And what they did is they used the fine-grained network of post offices, because there were post offices already all over the place. Most cities have lots of post offices. There was already a network, and they could use that network to create a banking network. And through the people's mailing behavior, they already knew something about them. So, and through people's use of their bank accounts that they knew something about them. And gradually, these banks then also started giving credit. And so these post banks first started not as credit banks, but as sort of deposit banks, just collecting deposits. And then later on, they also started making loans. In the US, this was also, in the US before the revolution, there were no banks because the Brits prohibited it. But then there were some banks later on, after the revolution, started mostly by insiders, so farmers, merchants, etc. Business relations, again, people that knew each other, and then outsiders had to start their own banks, and they did that too. But also always in networks of people who already knew each other, and then later on, in the South and the West, the states started these banks. Again, the governments intervened to also give other citizens access to banking. And now, what is happening now in emerging markets? What kind of solutions do we see? Well, like I said, mobile money is very promising. So if you look at adults with an account, for example, in South Africa, then you see that's a very developed market in Africa. So there, financial institutions are very important. But if you look at Kenya, for example, in Tanzania, there you see that actually mobile money, or a combination of a financial bank account and mobile money, is very much what people have. So, and this is actually from 2014. If you look at the current situation, this mobile money is growing like crazy, whereas traditional banking is not. So financial access to mobile money is really on the rise. Another way to do this is to have better identification of clients. So identification technology, for example, by fingerprinting, is also helping loan repayment. So there was a paper by Genet, Goldberg, and Yang, where they did an experiment where they had fingerprinted and a control group, and they looked whether people were paying back their loan, and you could see that they looked at the ex-ante probability of default. So basically they had 5 quintiles, 5 groups of people based on their probability of default, with the first quintile being the worst, so with the largest probability of default. And if people were not identified through fingerprints, they would indeed default a lot. But then if they were identifiable through their fingerprints, this withheld them from defaulting on their loans. So actually, they behaved better because they knew that they would be identified. Actually reducing moral hazard problems, reducing adverse selection problems. So even these people who were not good credits to begin with, because they knew they were being identified, were behaving actually now much better, in fact, as good as the other 4 groups in the sample. So this is again showing that this information issue plays a key role. Then there's something called a collateral registry. Collateral, if you have a loan, you can take a loan with collateral, like a mortgage has as a collateral the house. And if there's collateral registry, then that means that the access to finance is much bigger, because then banks are willing to lend to people in a far bigger way than if they're not. Because if they have this collateral registry, they know that a borrower has this collateral, really owns the collateral, owns a home, and that is for the banks a very important criterion to lend, and that increases the access to credit. Then there's financial education, really important. We know that from all kinds of research that financially literate people are more likely to be financially included. So there's all kinds of experiments with education, and the outcome of all these experiments is that yes, it seems to work, but the effects are kind of short-term. So, formal education only reaches the upper part of society, and so in South Africa, for example, they try to use a soap opera on television called Scandal for financial education, and it worked, but people also tended to forget the content of that in terms of financial education. And lastly, also really interesting, is new business models. Like I said, the key is to reduce this information asymmetry and to reduce bad behavior of borrowers. And for example, one example that I want to talk about is Banco Azteca in Mexico. What happened there is that there was an organization of electronic stores in Mexico, having about 500 stores all over Mexico. So they already had a branch network. And these stores sold electronic appliances on credit. So their clients had already a credit history, and that store knew about the credit history of these people. So they knew, hey, Juan is paying back his loans really very carefully, but Pablo, not so much. So we like Juan as a customer, also from a financial point of view, but Pablo, not so much. If we have that information, we can use that information to set up a bank, because that means that the information asymmetry is lower, because we know we can now distinguish the Juan from the Pablo, and we couldn't do that before. So they used this information to set up a banking branch, an overnight banking branch, and it really worked. And it also showed that, in fact, economic growth in the regions where Banco Azteca was present experienced more entrepreneurship, more new businesses, etc., because of that. So again, a very clever way to solve the Stiglitz and Weiss problem, and it really helped in terms of economic development. So in general, what you need in terms of tools to create more inclusion, more financial inclusion, is simplicity. You need endorsement by credible and well-reputed institutions so that people trust it. Good information network, fast repayments so that people don't sit on their loan for a long time but start repaying really quickly, and some consumer education. Okay, let's talk about the key takeaways of this part of the talk. Very importantly to realize, and hard to realize if you're living your life here in the West, is that if you don't have access to finance, your life becomes really far more complicated. I gave you some examples of payment systems, saving, storing your money. If you can't do these things, your life is much more complicated and also much more risky, so just less comfortable. There are some fundamental obstacles to financial inclusions. I talked about the ones mentioned by Stiglitz and Wise, so moral hazard, adverse selection, asymmetric information, but also don't forget scale. Making a small loan is very expensive and therefore requires a high interest rate, making it less attractive. Poor infrastructure. It's very difficult to start banks in countries where distances are big and there are hardly any roads. So these play a role too. And mobile money is playing a key role in increasing this financial inclusion. So I think if there's one hope in giving people more access to finance, more financial inclusion, that is mobile money, and it's really working. Now maybe some questions to reflect on. So on the one hand, you could say that the markets can solve this, but maybe it's a good idea for you to think about where and how emerging market governments can intervene to solve the lack of financial inclusion. How can they increase financial inclusion? What can they do? Or should governments in emerging markets just say, well, you know, markets is solving it, we have mobile money, you know, this is no longer of my concern, and we will see how things pan out. Well, that's one thing to think about. The second thing is I would like you to reflect on the future of banking in emerging markets. Is that future all going through mobile money, or do you also see a future more in the way that we've seen in Europe and the United States, with maybe post banks in cities or farmers cooperatives in the country? Think about that a bit. Maybe think about a specific country that you want to use as an example there, and then reflect on what we have been talking about in this lecture. Thank you very much.